Good evening, and thank you for the lovely introduction. Um, so I'm really honored to have been invited to talk here tonight, and I hope that everyone will enjoy what I'll be talking about. And I'm also looking forward to hearing some of the information, because I see that there are people from all over here. So it would be nice to also just do some knowledge sharing on the topic of marine invasions. And so what I'm going to be talking about tonight is more of an introduction to marine invasion biology. And then I'll speak um, a little bit about marine invasions in Africa and what we know, and then hone in a little bit on South Africa and the research that I'm currently busy with. Okay. So, before we dive into marine invasions, I thought it would be really nice to tell you a little bit about how I ended up in the field of marine invasion biology. I always knew I wanted to be a marine biologist, but somehow I ended up in my honors year working on a project that looked at cats. And if you don't know, and if you do have a cat, you are living with an invasive species. So domestic cats are known to be they're on the list of the 100 worst invasive species. Unfortunately, they're cute, they're cuddly, they are adorable, but they do have some kind of impact on the environment, particularly those that are allowed to roam freely. Um, and so that's where my journey in invasion biology started, essentially, was at the Percy Fitzpatrick Institute at the University of Cape Town, where we were interested to look at the movement patterns, so tracking cats, so looking at their movement patterns and also looking at what they were feeding on, and whether they were making use of green spaces that are conservation areas close to their homes. And so the maps that you see on the right are that's one of the maps that I was able to produce. And what we found was that they were indeed moving into these conservation spaces. And if you join all the dots, you can kind of see the route that the cat took. And I also heard lots of interesting stories from cat owners who said that, before they had a cat, their garden was thriving with reptiles and all sorts of little creatures. And when they got a cat, it was almost completely free of native wildlife. So that was really interesting. But that's what really hooked me into invasion biology, or onto invasion biology. And since I knew that the marine space is where I wanted to end up in, it was almost a natural progression into marine invasion biology. And so I thought, to get us all on the same page, I just want to try and see, I can't see the top of my screen. I thought it would be nice to go through this framework that invasion biologists use. And this framework is based on terrestrial invasion, so I've adapted it and simplified it slightly to give us a bit more of a marine feel. And so within the field of invasion biology, we have this umbrella term called alien species. And you will often see, if you are familiar with it, that in more of the international literature and legislation, they will refer to it as non-indigenous species, but essentially it's the same thing. And an alien species is a species that has been moved by humans from its natural habitat into a place in which it doesn't naturally occur. Okay, so basically what's important about that is that there's human involvement, human intervention in the movement of the species, and that's what makes it alien or introduced or non-indigenous. And sometimes the movement of the species is intentional, but more often than not, it's unintentional. And the impacts that a species can have in the environment might not be known. And so underneath this umbrella term, we have several several other terms that we use to categorize different alien species in. And with this particular framework, some of these terms we may not use in the same way in the marine space, but I'll try, as I go through the framework, I'll try to refer to some of these terms. So within the framework, we have 4 stages. And so a species that is introduced into an environment needs to overcome, sorry, that's my daughter. I don't know if everyone heard that scream. Needs to overcome particular barriers in order to reach a particular stage along the framework. And so the first barrier that a species needs to overcome to be called an alien or an introduced species is a geographical barrier. So there needs to be some transport mechanism that is human induced that moves a species from one area to another before we can call it an introduced species. And to use a marine example to try and demonstrate that a little bit clearly, if we imagine that there is a species occurring naturally on the west coast of South America. And so the geographical barrier is an ocean basin, but also continents. And you imagine that a ship has some species on it, which I'll get to a little bit later on. In this particular example, it's a crab. That ship then unintentionally moves that crab from the one space to another. So that transport is happening, it's human induced, and a geographical barrier is overcome that might not have been overcome naturally by that species. So once you are in that introduction space, perhaps the crab is now at a port on the west coast of South Africa, and perhaps it's still on the vessel, or it's settled in the port or in the harbor. The next barrier that it needs to overcome is, can it survive and reproduce in that new environment that it's in? And sometimes species don't survive, but often with invasive species, they do. And so the next barriers that they then overcome puts them in the stage of being established. So we now consider them as establishing themselves. So that little crab is happily surviving in the region, and maybe more than one crab, or it's a crab that is carrying eggs and it can successfully reproduce. And so now that species can be considered as being introduced as well as established, essentially. And so the final barrier that it needs to overcome is whether it can disperse or not from that harbor that it's now doing so well in. There are several generations of the particular crab occurring in the harbor, but can it spread beyond that point of introduction? And once an alien species is able to spread from its initial point of introduction and overcomes the barriers of dispersal, new environmental conditions, and enters into several other types of environments, that's when we classify them as invasive. And this is when they really become a concern. And so again, with our little crab example there, that dispersal can occur artificially. So it might be that now vessels are moving crabs to other harbors, but it can also occur naturally because many marine species have planktonic larval stages. So their larvae will be freely available in the water column, and they can move around with tides and currents and be delivered with waves. And so they can occur on the adjacent, just outside the harbor, the adjacent natural rocky shores, and they could then potentially spread further. And this becomes a real concern for us. And so it's really hard to manage a species when they've reached this stage of the invasion framework. And so, having said that, I just wanted to quickly touch on, before I go into marine invasions, how species are being moved around in general, particularly because I started speaking on cats. I just thought to give a broad perspective. So the most common way is through cargo transport. So any kind of transport mechanism, whether it's via air, water, land, those are all ways in which species can be spread into areas that they don't naturally occur, but also through agriculture, aquaculture, through nurseries, the aquarium and pet trade, the exotic pet trade. These are all ways or pathways that we consider when we think about invasive species. For the marine environment in particular, our predominant pathway, as you would imagine, and based on the example I gave in the framework, is shipping. So shipping is the predominant way in which marine species are moved around. And it would largely be due to the larger vessels, especially for primary introductions. And I'll speak a little bit about the vectors associated with that. But we're also starting to see that recreational vessels are able to play quite an important role in the transfer of marine alien species, particularly the secondary spread of marine alien and invasive species. And so there are certain vectors associated with these pathways for how species are being transferred. So the pathway would be shipping, and then a vector would be how is that species associated with that ship and how is it being moved around. And so that has changed over time, but I'd like to start by speaking to what happened in the past, how a species moved around in the past, because some of these species are still present in the places that they've been introduced to. So even though the vector was historical, the species are allowed to persist, or they persist rather. So historically, vessels were made out of wood, and dry ballasts were used to stabilize the vessel. So the dry ballasts are essentially the rocks and the sand that were put into the inner part of the hull, if you want to call it, of the vessels to stabilize them. So the rocks would generally have been taken up in one area and then offloaded in another. And along with the rocks and the sand are little species or organisms that live in between them. And so essentially you're moving species from one area to another. Then the fact that the vessels were made out of wood also acted as a vector. So fouling, which is essentially the growth of organisms on a particular substrate. In this case, this species was a wood-boring species known as a shipworm, which is a bit, it's not a worm, it's essentially a mollusk, bivalve mollusk, like a clam, and they're able to bore into wooden structures. And so these species could then, when they reach a new environment, release themselves into the water and establish in the harbor. And with wooden structures in the harbor, you would also get this kind of situation occurring. So that's what happened in the past. At the moment, with vessels being made out of different materials, we're now moving to steel, fiberglass, etc., different types of materials. The pathway remains. So shipping and recreational boating, for example, the pathways are still the same, but the vectors associated with those pathways have changed. So now what is currently being used as a form of ballast is water. So ballast water is a very well-known vector for the transfer of marine alien species. So you can see in the image here, there's a large vessel discharging ballast water in a port. And the same concept applies, which I will show you, give a bit of a better visual in the next slide. And then, of course, because the vessels are no longer made of wood, and even with the ballast water, a different type of species, different groups of species were now and are currently now being transferred amongst harbors. And so biofouling, and the term that's commonly used is hull fouling, but I feel that biofouling is a more accurate term because these organisms don't only settle on the hulls, but also any other submerged structures of the vessels, like the propellers, the propeller shafts, rudders, keels, etc. So, so these are currently the main ways through which marine species are being transferred from one area to another. And just to show you, give you a bit of a better visual of what ballast water actually is as a vector. So if you have a vessel without ballast water in it, it's a very unstable vessel. that water is in there to essentially for safety reasons to keep the vessel stable and safe in the water. And so again, the same concept as with the dry ballast applies, where they're taking up water in one region with species that might be native to that region, or it's a mixture of native and non-native species in that region. That vessel is then going to move to a port where it's going to pick up cargo. It's going to load cargo. And in order to load cargo, they have to discharge their ballast water because, of course, the weight, the added weight, is going to influence the vessel in the water. So when they release that water, they are releasing alien species into the environment where you also have native species occurring. And that's essentially now you have basically overcome the transport barrier and you're looking at or the geographical barrier, and you're looking at an alien or introduced species. But ballast water has been very well recognized as a threat to biodiversity in terms of its role with introducing species. And as a result, the Ballast Water Management Convention came into play in 2004. And so for the most part, it's not gone as planned yet or as it was envisioned yet, but for the most part, countries that are signatories to the convention, they need to have measurements in place in order to treat their ballast water so that this vector is somewhat being managed. And so we assume that there's a reduction in the risk of ballast water or vessels with ballast water being able to transfer species. And several countries do have treatment systems where they treat their ballast water. But biofouling as a whole is relatively unregulated. There are no binding legislation that deals with biofouling as a concern, as a threat for moving species around in the environment. And it's in the works. We are currently working on something, but at the moment it's largely unregulated. Particularly along our coastline, but there are countries like Australia and New Zealand that are quite good with managing biofouling as a vector. And as you can see, what you end up having is this biofouling layer with species that can grow quite densely and can survive. Some will survive the journey, some won't. And so you really have a combination of both ballast water, if you're looking at large vessels, and biofouling. So it's like a double threat for the movement of species within the marine environment. And of course, because shipping or boating, any kind of vessel is a predominant pathway through which species are transferred in the ocean, harbors, ports, and marinas are hotspots for marine alien species. So if you're looking for alien species, this is the place you will definitely find at least one. And so if you're walking along the jetty in harbors and you kind of look down and you see animals and plants growing just below the surface, that's essentially biofouling. You're looking at biofouling, and these communities will be made up of both alien and native species. And that's really what we are interested in looking at, which I'll get to at the end, close to the end. So I focused quite a lot on shipping or vessels as a pathway, but there are, of course, other pathways that transfer species around in the marine environment. And fishing gear is one of them. So ghost nets, ghost fishing gear, they often have a growth occurring, and that those nets can just move around with the currents and transfer species. I've already mentioned the exotic pet trade. So let's say someone has a pet, they no longer want the pet or can no longer keep the pet, and they think that a good thing to do is to release it out into the wild. And often that species is not native to the region. And so the lionfish is a good example of where something like that has occurred, and it's become quite invasive in a couple of regions. Aquaculture is another pathway. So, and this is an example from South Africa where oysters are being farmed. And so often the species that's being farmed is not native to the region. So the actual species being farmed out in the open water is not indigenous to the region. But then along with that, you also have, especially in the case of the oysters, that often have animals growing on the shells or within the shells. With this particular oyster, there's also a polychaete that bores into the shells, which is also not native to the region, and that polychaete now does occur along our coast. So another pathway, and then an emerging pathway for a few regions is petroleum infrastructure. So oil rigs, and barges that are towed when they deconstruct them or for maintenance purposes. Often they have biofouling occurring on them when they're submerged structures. And so when they're moving these structures, it's often at a slow pace. And that moving at that slow pace actually increases the chances of species and organisms rather surviving the journey. And so you can also have species being introduced in that way. So we have a better idea now, I hope, of what marine alien species are, how they are transferred in the marine environment. But why do we care from a conservation perspective? Are these species actually demonstrating any kind of impact? And for many of the species, I mean, by nature, a new species coming into that environment is going to have some kind of impact. But often we say that for many of the species, the impact might be considered as being benign. Maybe they just occur in one little area and they don't really take over the space, or they're not really strong competitors. But with many of the invasive species, so once they've reached that invasive stage, they do have quite drastic impacts. And I've only shown 2 examples here today. And I'm going to focus first on the environmental one. So the species on the slide on the left is an algal species called Koebraa taxifolia. And both of these examples are invasive species along the African coastline. So Koebraa taxifolia is more in the northern region, so it was introduced to the Mediterranean, and it's native to the Indian and Pacific oceans. And this particular species was introduced accidentally via an aquarium, and it essentially transformed the system. It creates these monospecific stands where it competes and outcompetes the native algal species, and as a result has caused a reduction in the native biodiversity in several regions to which it's been introduced. And so, of course, all the species that were reliant on the native algal species were then moved out. And that, of course, has knock-on impacts on the entire system. Then the species on the right is a filter-feeding marine invertebrate called the sea vase ascidian or tunicate or sea squid, Siona robusta. And this species is quite interesting. You will see them appearing, they'll appear and then they'll disappear in the harbors, at least here, based on what we've been seeing. But where they really have an impact is in the aquaculture industry, but also on vessels. They often overgrow the hulls of vessels. So in terms of its socioeconomic impact, it really is on the aquaculture industry. So on the right here are basically mussel ropes that are completely overgrown by these tunicates, and they essentially smother the mussels, and eventually the mussels die. They're both filter feeding species, so it's also taking away a resource, but covering it completely by smothering it, and of course that affects the productivity of the aquaculture operations. And so you have a knock-on socioeconomic impact with this particular species. So of course, these are examples where I forgot to say that this species occurs quite often in South African harbors and ports, and they were introduced through shipping, likely through ballast water, so as larvae in the ballast tanks. And so these are 2 examples where we really see massive impacts and knock-on effects, because they can have direct and indirect impacts within the systems that they've been able to invade. And I think what's really important about these species, to note about these species, is that they are really good at competing. They have fast reproductive rates. They have high reproductive success. They are released from their predators and any pathogens and diseases that they would have been exposed to in their native habitat. When they reach the new environment, they kind of released from that form of natural control. And so all of those factors together allows them to proliferate in the introduced environment. Okay, so those were two examples from of invasions in Africa. And what else do we know about marine invasions in Africa? And I must add a disclaimer here, this is still a work in progress. But what at the moment, at least a total of 14 countries have information readily available on marine invasions. And again, I must add the disclaimer that this might not necessarily be the case on the ground. It might be that there are other regions that have records of marine invasive species and that just hasn't been accessed yet. Often these numbers are sitting in reports that for varying reasons have not been published and isn't necessarily available online. And then also, if anyone in the audience has data points to add onto this map, please raise it in the Q&A session at the end. I would love to add, especially on the western side of Africa, some more points on the map. But I think with mentioning these disclaimers and recognizing these gaps at the moment, I think in here lies an important point that as an African nation, we have something to work on. Like, collaboration would be really great for anyone who's working on marine invasions. And before I gave another talk earlier on last month on marine invasions in Africa, in that space, we built on that knowledge just based on who was in the audience and that the information wasn't necessarily available. So I think it would be great if we have a database where we can all share our information so that we can all be better informed on what's happening in terms of marine invasions along the African coast. And I must say, even the updated number for South Africa that I'm going to report on has not been published yet. So at the moment, people are still using the number that's currently out there. And so I just want to give an idea of what the numbers look like in terms of what we know about marine invasions within each of these countries. So we have the number of species on the y-axis across all of the countries that are listed on the map. And so the blue bars are the total numbers of known alien species in the regions. And then the orange part of the bar are cryptogenic species. So cryptogenic species are species that have an unknown origin. We can't quite pin where they came from. We're not really sure what their native range is. They're so widespread. And so we can't really call them alien or invasive species. But what's interesting about these species is that they often demonstrate the characteristics of invasive species. So generally, we will find them along with alien and invasive species. They may or may not be quite widespread or quite abundant in a region, but because we don't know its origin, we can't place it in that category of alien or invasive species. And I think what you can immediately see from the graph is that the peaks there, the highest numbers of alien species are in the southernmost and northernmost regions of Africa. And again, if anybody wants to update these numbers, please give me a shout. And what I want to note on this point is that it doesn't necessarily mean that these regions are the ones that have more marine alien species. It's just that these regions are well studied at the moment as a result of the researchers and the academics that focus on marine invasions within those countries, within those spaces. And so the lower numbers that we are seeing on the graph could just be a case of additional surveys not having been undertaken in those areas to update those numbers. Or like I said, surveys might have been done, but the information online has not been updated. And so it's great to have numbers from such a high number of countries within Africa, but there are definitely gaps that we need to work on. And often, if it can't necessarily be put into these surveys because of lack of resources, lack of capacity, lack of trained taxonomists and invasion biologists, maybe even interest. And so the numbers are not a reflection of saying that these countries have less alien species per se. We don't know. We don't actually know whether that is the case or not. One other point I wanted to mention is that for some regions, just because there aren't any numbers being shown for cryptogenic species doesn't mean that there aren't any cryptogenic species there. It might just be that those haven't been listed in the publications where these numbers are coming from. But a very interesting pattern that we're seeing at the moment. And like I said, it's still a work in progress. In terms of the species that occur across the regions, I just thought I would list some ones that look really interesting and cool. And they range from ascidians that I mentioned earlier. So this is again that sea-vase ascidian Siona robusta. And then on the right here is the light bulb ascidian, also an invasive species. You often see them in marinas. And then in the middle, here, top middle, are bryozoan species, and they come in different forms. So this is an encrusting bryozoan, and these are individuals that make up this little colony of animals. It doesn't necessarily look like animals, but they are. And then you have a more of a branching form that looks more like a plant, looks like an algal species, but actually it's an animal. And then this guy, well, this is a female actually. It's called the Japanese skeleton shrimp, Caprella mutica, and this was a new introduction that I found in one of our marinas. We were kind of expecting the species to arrive on our coastline, and my supervisor at the time, Charles Griffiths, was always looking out for it, and I was so happy. I shouldn't have been happy as an invasion biologist, but so happy that I found it. I was like, oh my gosh, I think I found it. And so these particular shrimp are not in fact shrimp, they're actually amphipods. And they are a cause for concern because they are quite aggressive, and we do have endemic amphipods, endemic caprellids in the region. And so if these were to spread outside of marinas, they could be a concern, and that's kind of what we want to avoid. Then there's this reef building tube worm, Phycopomatus. Some of you may be familiar with it. The European shore crab, and then along several of the coastlines are a range of introduced mussel species, and this is the one that I will just speak about in the next slide for what we know about marine invasions in South Africa. So at the moment, the total known number of marine alien species in South Africa, we're looking at 99 species at the moment, and more than 50% of those are invasive, which means that more than 50%, actually close to 60%, have spread from the initial point of introduction, either across harbors, and some of them also into the adjacent natural spaces, either intertidally and or subtidally. And how we got to this number is largely due to a very small group of researchers across these institutions. So it started out, the work on marine invasions started out at UCT, and then at the Robinson Marine Lab, where I was based initially, expanded on that, and we are now working together where I'm based now at the Department of Conservation and Marine Sciences at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology, we're working together to keep that list updated and to, of course, try and figure out what some of the impacts are, and I'll get to that in the next slide. I just quickly wanted to mention the Mediterranean mussel. Some of you may be very familiar with the species. It's one of the most, it's the most widespread invasive species along the South African coastline. And before the species had, and this is only an example of one site, before the species had invaded, our rocky shores looked very different. And it's actually in my background. That's a picture that I took when I was doing field work with one of my students. And it completely, once it was able to reach the rocky shores, it completely transformed the rocky shore zonation patterns. You can see that it completely pushed out these ascidians, which is redbait. They're both filter feeding species. It was able to successfully push it out. And then on other parts of, for example, in the one in the background, pushes out limpet species, indigenous mussels. You barely see them. You may or may not see one or two in between this dense bed of Mytilus. And so overall, it's pushed out indigenous mussels, limpets, it's changed the zonation patterns. Overall, it's had a negative impact. But interestingly, the smaller species were doing quite well because they were now able to occur in between these dense mussel beds. So you're seeing an increase in abundance of those species. And as a result of that, our oyster catchers that were of conservation concern could feed in these mussel beds, and we actually saw the population doing better. So some positives and negatives there, but overall for the rocky shore ecosystem, not that great. So I'm close to the end, just to tell you a little bit of some of the research that we're doing currently. So in addition to doing surveys across, so part of the research that I did, I don't know, maybe more than 10 years ago, was to sample 14 harbors along our coastline to try and find out which alien species we have and how abundant they were. We're expanding on that now because based on the research that I did previously, recreational vessels came out as being quite an important predictor of high numbers of alien species. And so at the moment, my students in the picture and myself, we are working on looking at the ecological succession of these biofouling species. And so we are tracking the settlement patterns of marine biofouling communities to try and figure out which species are settling first. Are native or alien species settling first? Which species are able to dominate the space? How does that community change over time? And what does that mean for the biofouling that occurs on vessels? And we're finding some interesting patterns. So on this plate, which is we're tracking it for 8 months. I mean, this is only 3 months that you're seeing now. So already there are 4 invasive species on the slide. This particular one is a native species, and then basically there's a colonial ascidian covering everything that's underneath, and the species underneath is a cryptogenic species. This is Siona robusta out of water. And so what we're seeing is that at certain depths and at a particular time, native species are able to compete successfully with the invasive species, but we're still in the process of disentangling those patterns. And what's important about this is that it can give us an indication of when are high risk periods, when are alien species settling, that would be a concern for vessels moving during that period of time. So those are some of the things that we're trying to answer with that research, and also to detect new alien species quite early on. So having said that, how do we, in the space of conservation, try and address marine invasions when we have such an interconnected system? When a species is introduced into the environment, and more often than not, it has a larval phase that is planktonic and that can easily spread. And you will see that prevention is better than cure. And so really what we need to try and do is to prevent these species from being moved around in the first place. And in order to do that, we need to manage the pathways. So manage the vectors and the pathways of how these species are being moved around. And there are treatment systems in place. There are new methods and ideas in the works for how we can do that. But that's another whole talk on its own. And so that's where I will end off this evening. And I want to say thank you to everyone for listening and for the LCA team to have invited me to talk this evening. Thank you.
I must say I found that exceptionally interesting. We don't have very many questions in the chat, so I'm just going to ask everybody at the bottom of your screen. There's a reactions tool. If you just want to hover over that, and then you'll put your raise your hand if you want to ask any questions, or feel free to just type into the chat and ask some questions there. But we'd love to encourage you to turn on your camera and to ask your question yourself, because it almost leads in a question and then an answer, and then I think often that leads on to the next thing. So please don't feel shy. And again, I must say, Koebraa, you said you were nervous. There was absolutely no reason at all to be nervous. You did a sterling job and spoke very well. So
thank you.
Thanks very much. Anybody want to put up their hands? I have a couple of questions of my own. I'm actually normally famous for asking questions off the bat. So if no one else has got any questions, I have had a look at the chat. There's not anything specifically as a question. There, Danao, I'll ask you to unmute, Danao. And then if you can ask your question, and again, feel free to turn on your camera as well. Just when it pops up on your screen, just unmute yourself. Great, Roland, if you want to ask Koebraa your question.
Okay, we've been dealing with marine invasive aquatic species. Is there any work that you know of that's been done on freshwater systems? Because I'm involved in the interior of Africa. I'm in Angola, and I work in the Okavango and those areas. And I'm sure that there are many fish species from aquariums and that could be a problem into freshwater systems like the Okavango. So is there anybody, any organization that you could refer me to?
Thanks, Roland.
Thank you for the question. I can't off the top of my head think of any organizations, but there are definitely academics and researchers working on freshwater invasive species. I can't even think off the top of my head. I see the person's face, but I can't think of what their name is. That's definitely working on freshwater species, particularly invasive fish species in freshwater ecosystems here in South Africa, but then also along other parts of, especially East Africa. There are a couple of organizations where I have seen reports of invasive freshwater species, but I can't off the top of my head think, because I'm not really working in that space. Some of the estuarine species we do as well, but completely freshwater. I'll have to get back to you if my details can maybe be shared, and then we can get in touch on that.
That'll be perfect.
I know who to contact, but I just can't. I can't. I'll have to do a search for their name.
Marty, if it's possible, if something could be posted that I could refer to, either email me or something. I mean, we are well aware of the aquatic plants, but when it comes to the other things, not very much.
100%. So we will share that. And I think there was a previous talk where they also spoke about certain invasive species in one of the recordings. So I can go and have a look for that, and I'll share that with you as well, Roland. Thanks for your question.
Yeah, thank you. And I know that the Nile perch, for example, is a major one, but I do know about that. But there, I'm sure many things that we don't know.
Oh,
Cool.
that's my daughter.
Thanks,
Okay, thank you.
Roland. Then Kathleen Deely, I'll ask you to unmute.
Okay, good evening, everybody. I'm Kathleen. I'm from Namibia. It's the first time I joined this discussion. Koebraa was a very interesting talk. I must say I'm quite a big fan of you because I read all your papers.
Oh, wow.
Raising the
Thank you.
flag, alien cruising in, because I'm now involved in a project. We're looking at the marine invasive species in Namibia. So I will maybe contact you in future because I'm on study
Definitely.
leave, so I'm doing that. But I wanted to
Please, yeah.
respond to Roland as well. My colleague at the University of Namibia, he's also working in the Kavango area. So, and he's doing freshwater because I'm the marine person and he's the freshwater person. So I can give you his details. I will just in the chat box because then you can talk to him as well because he's doing a lot of work and he works with NNF, Namibia Nature Foundation. So he's quite knowledgeable about that. So I just wanted to respond to that.
No, thanks, Kathleen. And this is exactly why we do this, networking and joining the dots between different people. So that's awesome. And thanks for commenting. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
I think Danaya had tried to talk. So she has typed a question. If I can just read it. She just says, thank you for the informative talk. Does climate change play a role in exacerbating marine invasion? And if so, how?
That's a really great question because it does play a role, of course. So in general, marine invasive species have very broad environmental tolerances. So they can cope with broad ranges of temperatures, certain species salinities, and they thrive in harbors where you have high levels of pollution. In terms of climate change, there is research currently underway in the Robinson lab, so not necessarily where I'm based, but they are looking at the potential impact that climate change can have in terms of the spread of invasive species. And so we might actually see different species coming in with the changes that we're seeing as a result of climate change. And then we might also be seeing species extending their ranges, just like the native species are doing, either extending or shifting ranges. And so, yes, absolutely, it does play a role. And it's definitely going to change what we will be seeing in the future. And also, in addition to that, there are some experimental studies currently being undertaken in terms of how ocean acidity is going to affect particular species. So changes in the pH of the waters and how it will affect both native and invasive species. So yeah, definitely an influence there, which is likely not going to be great.
Okay, cool. So Danaya pinched one of my questions. I was asking, does water temperature have an effect on these invaders? So thanks, Danaya, for asking that. I'm glad you did. There's no other questions in the chat, so I'm going to watch for hands. But in the meantime, I just wanted to ask, and you sort of alluded to cleaning and trying to remove before the vessels leave. But in a way, listening to it, and I don't want to be negative, but it feels like, the damage has been done already. It's you've got things from all over the world cross-pollinating and that sort of stuff. And if I just look at a smaller area like Hartbeespoort Dam and the highest and the battles that they've been facing, are there kind of realistic solutions to these problems? And I know just sort of prompted from that, often what's the solution is to bring in the predators from the other areas to try and control the species. And have you looked at any of those sort of solutions?
I almost want to say that in the marine space, that would be a nightmare, bringing in biocontrol. But one of my students are very optimistic. So, for example, with Mytilus, we think that it's impossible to manage something like Mytilus. It's basically part of the system now. And one of my students are very optimistic, and he says, I shouldn't say it's impossible. With everything progressing and advancing at the moment, there might be a potential solution in the future. But just to answer your question on the prevention of moving species around, yes, the damage is done for this in terms of the species that occur here already, but there are constantly new introductions occurring. And we want to particularly prevent, for example, predatory invasive species from being introduced. So like the caprellid amphipod and the European shore crab, they're both here already, but at the moment they're restricted to mariners. And so by having these management interventions in place where we can maybe detect a species quite early on, there have been successful, successful eradication attempts where a species was detected early on and a rapid response was implemented. It was on a vessel, so monitoring vessels, incoming vessels, and this was not here, it was in Australia, of course. They picked up that species immediately. They had a decontamination berth where that vessel went into, the species was removed, and they avoided that invasion. But it is challenging because you're dealing with, I don't know what, 20 harbors along your coastline, thousands of vessels. How are you actually going to manage that in reality? And countries like Australia and New Zealand that have the resources, that have the capacity, they are doing really well. I was at a conference in May, and I couldn't understand how the New Zealand scientists were doing what they were explaining. They were checking vessels, had to submit reports before they enter their waters, pictures of their hulls. So they need to actually have an ROV or a diver with an underwater camera. They need to submit pictures of their hulls. And their system is working. I was shocked. It must be a massive undertaking. But there are ways and means that are working, and particularly with the prevention mechanisms. So preventing biofouling preventing biofouling occurring in the first place. Those are ways that we can not only prevent new introductions, but also prevent secondary spread. So if a species is here in one harbor, we at least could then prevent it from being transferred from that harbor to another or to several harbors along the coast. But it is challenging. It's very tricky in the marine environment. And even just trying to manage existing biofouling growth is hard. And that's why we're saying that prevention is ultimately going to be the next best thing, because if you're not moving species around in the first place, then we wouldn't be sitting with that, at least with an exacerbated problem. But the species that are already here, there are ways for certain species that we can contain them and we can remove them. But for other species, it's not been that great. So we had an eradication attempt of the European shore crab that was unsuccessful here. And it's just because they occur in such high numbers, that those high reproductive rates that I was talking about, tens of thousands of these crabs were manually removed from, they're restricted to 2 harbors at the moment here in South Africa. And within 2 months, that number just skyrocketed again. And so it depends on the species, and it also depends on how early you pick them up. That I'm trying to hold on to the little bit of positivity to answer.
So in a way, you pinched my third question, so that's fine. But I was going to kind of ask you. You mentioned Australia, New Zealand in your talk, and maybe if you've got an idea of what is their budget to do that and how many people are involved, because it must be almost like an army. I mean, it's the cost, and who picks up the cost? Is it the companies that are the trawling vessels or whatever they are? I can't think of those ocean going vessels, and do they pick up the price tab for that? And I mean, I know from other things with Australia, if you're trying to take in anything, if you get caught, the fines are astronomical. So possibly that's where they're getting some of the money from. But yeah, maybe you've got some more ideas on budgets, and I suppose we could lobby Parliament or whatever to try and get these in. But yeah, I think it's a huge undertaking.
It is a massive undertaking. And to answer your question about Australia's budget, I don't know the numbers, but it's high. The amount, it's a huge investment. But they do have a combination of government funding as well as private companies. So there's a particular program, and I can't remember if it's in Australia or New Zealand, where they actually have private companies on board to assist with some of these management initiatives. And then also quite a few regions have citizen scientists on board. So just the general public, where awareness is raised on which species are invasive, you then immediately have a system where you can add that to the system, and everyone then knows the species was detected here. They can then, of course, confirm whether it is that species or not. And it's just like a huge, well, I want to say community that actually ends up playing a role in. And that's also what happened with the eradication attempt here. It was a number of volunteers that were involved with trying to get rid of that European shore crab. But yeah, that wasn't a great success.
I think one of the solutions is to put it on the menu and make people want to eat it, and then it'll be controlled big time.
They were looking, well, that's the mussel. I forgot to say the Mediterranean mussel is quite important in our aquaculture industry now. That's one of the mussels that we're eating in the restaurants. But the European shore crab, they had looked into using it as a food source, but apparently that wasn't a great idea. First of all, they're coming from very polluted harbors, so not ideal. But they were looking into using it as feed for some animal. I can't remember. But I don't think that worked out yet, or they never took it further. Yeah.
Okay, cool. No, thanks, Richard. I've unmuted you. You can shoot forward with your question.
Yeah, thank you. So your question on the budget got me thinking. Conservation means invest in resources. So how do you quantify, or do you think quantifying the effects of this invasive species can help to prioritize, controlling some species over others, especially where there are multiple invasions? Are there models that are in place to quantify the, ecosystem impacts or ecological impacts, such that if we have species A, maybe up to F, we can prioritize resources to species F?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we haven't actually done that. We do have a paper where we worked on cost actually. Again, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was more cost of not so much managing, but more monitoring. But to just go back onto your question, which is a really great question, what we have done in terms of modeling is trying to prioritize harbors that can be, or pinpoint harbors that can be prioritized for management. And that was part of my PhD research. So I might be a little bit rusty on the outcomes because it was a long time ago. But based on that research, what we found was that at least the models, the more smaller harbors that also have recreational vessels there had the highest numbers of alien species. And so we had recommended that those, if we do get budget allocated to manage pathways or manage harbors or implement some kind of monitoring system, then these are the harbors that you need to be focusing on. So in terms of harbors, we've done that, but in terms of species, it's actually quite tricky because we haven't really quantified the impact of many of these species, and the problem is capacity for researchers who can focus on impact. So the species that we have information on in terms of impact are the ones that are widespread. So like the Mediterranean mussel, there's a barnacle, Balanus trigonus, and then Siona, we also, impact was assessed for Siona in terms of biodiversity impact, and there wasn't a very clear outcome there, but from socioeconomic perspective, that would be something that definitely would have to be prioritized from a management perspective. But thank you for raising that, because now you're giving me lots of study ideas.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. So I think this also leads me on to the question that Kathleen Deely added after she had spoken, just on the hull fouling being unregulated. Any idea when that may be enforced in our waters?
That is a great question. So we only this year submitted our, as part of the GESAMP working group. So we were about 14 scientists from, well, from different, not only scientists, we had people, well, not only academics, so academics and industry partners from 14 different countries, and we were all biofouling experts or linked to biofouling in one way or another. And so we've only just finalized our report that is sitting with GESAMP at the moment. So it's the first biofouling working group that we had that's ever existed, basically. And so eventually that report will go to the UN, and we're just sitting and waiting, basically. I don't have a date. I don't even have a year at the moment, but it's just great that it's in progress. And yeah, and what we're finding is that it would be very tricky because it's so context specific. It's quite tricky to enforce legislation that will be feasible for every region. Because we have to take into consideration, and that's why I was really glad that I was there, because we have to take into consideration developing nations that do not have the resources that Australia and New Zealand and all the other countries have. And so, yeah, I'm waiting for it to unfold, but we've done our part for now, and so we're just sitting and waiting for feedback at the moment.
I mean, just something that I think I've heard of before, that when a marine vessel, whatever the case is, has a whole lot of junk stuck on its hull, it makes it exceptionally inefficient, and it's and it would be great if we could almost motivate it from that side, so that it's a win-win for both parties. But kind of my immediate thought is, okay, they're going to clean it off and they're going to scrape it into the harbor and let it settle on the floor, which is not exactly what you want. And the practicalities of actually removing the whole ship or boat or whatever and cleaning it underneath properly, yeah, obviously those costs are astronomical. Just there was a question earlier in terms of, and I don't know whether you can necessarily answer it, but I'm sure you can comment on it, why the Western African countries are not involved in this initiative. And then just further on that, Danao said, from the African map side, I noticed that most landlocked countries do not have research on marine invasion. Does that mean that it's not problematic there? So I think obviously marine in the landlocked isn't an issue, but the estuarine, or what Roland was talking about, is an issue. And then the further part of the question, is it an ocean problem, or it includes all aquatic environments, including rivers? So I think it's partly been answered, but maybe if you can talk about the West African story, if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, so I don't necessarily think that, so this isn't a program per se, this is just a collation of information from different African countries, and a program is kind of what I'm calling for. It would be great. And so Kathleen, please do get in touch with me. It would be great if we can, have more collaborative projects and programs in place. But to answer the question on why Western countries are not involved, or that there are no numbers for them, I don't think that it's because they may not, as I mentioned before, with my disclaimer, it might be that they have actually done surveys for marine species. It I just haven't been able to access any numbers. And that's why I said it's still a work in progress. So I am going to try and get some more information on whether they have done any surveys for marine invasives. And then just to quickly add on to why there are so many East African countries that have done surveys. Those are part of the baseline port biological surveys. So because they were part of the I know the acronym, a Gullah Somali large marine ecosystem, because they're part of that program. All of the countries were involved and had baseline port biological, I might have that the wrong way around, port baseline biological surveys being undertaken, and that's how they were able to get numbers for marine invasive species. So it's not to say that Western African countries don't have any numbers or haven't done any surveys. That information just isn't readily available at the moment.
Yeah, well, I think we're using the network, and Kathleen, you need to talk to your neighbors. So you need to find out from Angola, and then they can find out from their next neighbor. So please keep in touch, and yeah, I just wish you guys all the best for this initiative. As I said, in a way, it feels like a drop in the ocean. Excuse the pun, but all the best in your efforts to let me call it, purify our marine waters. And I mean, I just was thinking, you know, there are so many things that the marine environment is facing, from pollution to you know, all of these other things, and only then to also have these tiny little microbes and all kinds of weird and wonderful things. And I mean, I'd never even thought of the ballast water being an issue, but I mean, that's thousands of liters of dodgy stuff. I mean, how do they actually purify that? Do they like heat it up and cook it like a soup, or do they put poison in there? Because again, anything that they're throwing out, they're going to still throw into the harbor. So what do you do with, because there's literally thousands of liters of water in that ballast. So I don't know if you want to tell us some of the solutions that how they do that.
So they do have treatments, they're different treatment systems, but essentially they would have tanks in a port where that water gets pumped into, and they have microscopes and things set up, and they basically surveying, they essentially monitoring what's in the water, and then they do have different treatment systems which can involve temperature changes, adding toxins or chemicals, what's the other, light treatment as well, that can kill particular species, and that applies to biofouling as well, actually. But so if a port has a treatment system in place, the water will go through that treatment system, and it won't, of course, if there are toxins involved, it won't immediately be dispelled into the harbor. They need to make sure also that they are zapping as many little organisms as possible to make sure that that risk is quite low when they are discharging water back into the port. But it's, yeah, it's challenging.
No, cool. Well, I think without any other hands up or any other questions in the chat, I've really enjoyed this evening's talk, and have learned hopefully a lot. And yeah, really wish you well in all your efforts. And we look forward to some feedback of how you've added further Western African countries to your studies. And yeah, well done. Great talk.
Thank you so much, and thank you, everyone.
Shukran, Koebraa.
One.
Thanks, guys. So that's the evening, and thanks everyone for joining us. And please do join us next week. I think it's going to be a very interesting and maybe somewhat controversial discussion on the panel discussion about zoos and conservation. So I think let's get a lot of people in there. If they're vehemently angry about zoos or they vehemently want zoos, let's get everybody on and let's have the discussion, because that's how we all learn and are educated. So thanks for adding to our education this evening, Koebraa.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Mike.
There's a question in the chat that is actually,
sorry.
Can I quickly address it?
Yeah, go for it. I missed it. Sorry.
That's okay. It came in as you were talking, and the question is about whether there's any relationship between marine plastic pollution and invasive species? And that is a great question, because we are working on that as well, but that's more of a so it's more of a global project that's taking place, where we are collecting plastics from the beaches that have biofouling on them, and we are seeing species that we don't recognize. Of course, once they wash up on the beach, they're already dead, but that doesn't mean that any of the plastics that still are in the water column, it's a vector. So that's another vector of species being moved around. There are organisms growing on marine plastics, and so yes, there's definitely a relationship between marine plastic pollution and invasive species. Just to answer that question.
Cool. Thanks, Sabile, for squeaking it in the last second there. And I think on that note, we'll say good evening, and thanks everyone for attending, and all the best for your hard work that you've done, and wish you every success.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye,
you.
everyone.